And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks, episode 53. But before I get to the cards, just a quick little side note. I've had a couple of people in the comments of my 10 cards videos, and maybe some of my other videos as well, talk about how I'm reading something that isn't on the actual card. This happened recently with a Neuro Griffin, where the text that I was reading was quite a bit different, in fact, from what was on the actual card. And the reason for that is I always read the errata text. For all the cards that I read on my channel, I always read the most recent errated text. A lot of creature types have changed, stuff like that. So for those who don't know, any newer players, cards get errated all the time. What it says on the card doesn't necessarily mean that's what it is. Newer cards are usually okay this way, but especially a lot of older cards, and of course I read a lot of older cards on my channel, the text is wildly different from what it used to be. You know, the rules have changed quite a bit over the years. That's one of the reasons. Also, some of the reasons is because the interactions don't work the same. There's sometimes actual misprints. Card types have changed, right? Obviously, culling the weak is not a mana source anymore, right? Because there's no such thing as a card type mana source. It's an instant. So when I read cards, it's always the errated text. It's the updated text. I read it directly from the Wizards of the Coast website so that I make sure I get it right. So just so everyone knows, that's why the text that I read doesn't always match up with the cards. So with that being said, let's get to the list. And coming in at number 1 this week, Pull from Eternity. And I've talked about this card a number of times on my channel already. It's in my pet cards video because it is one of my favorite pet cards. Even though I don't put it in a ton of decks, I like to put it in as many decks as I can because it is actually very versatile and incredibly unique. Finally got to it in the 10 cards video, so now I'm talking about it. 1 white mana instant. Put target face-up exiled card into its owner's graveyard. Pull from Eternity I particularly like because, like I said, there's just so many ways to use this card. It doesn't seem like it. I talked about this at length on my pet cards video, but in case you missed that, for me, I currently have this card in 2 decks. So the first one is my Dennick deck. Now, why is it in my Dennick deck? Well, when Dennick is flipped over and then dies, it exiles itself. And of course, when your commander gets exiled, you're going to put it back in the command zone, but then I have to cast my commander again, then let it die, then disturb it to get it flipped over again. That's a whole lot of hoops to jump through. With Pull from Eternity, if I have it in my hand, I can let my commander go to exile and then just for 1 white mana, chuck it in the graveyard so then I can immediately disturb it again. It's a fantastic include in that deck. I think it should go in every Dennick deck for that reason. Not that there's a lot of people out there playing that commander. I also have it in my Sigrid deck, right? And why do I have it in there? Well, my opponent attacks with a creature, I flash out my Sigrid, exile that creature, and then when my Sigrid leaves the battlefield, it'll come back into play. Unless I use Pull from Eternity. Right now I'm going to use this on my opponent's creatures. This can be on your stuff or your opponent's stuff. So my opponent has that creature exiled, waiting for my commander to leave the battlefield. Well, now I'm just going to chuck it in their graveyard, right? And assuming they're not playing a recursion deck, now they're not going to be able to get it back. When my Sigrid leaves the battlefield, it's not going to come back into play. This works with any blink strategy, right? So if you're playing against a blink deck, like a rune deck, and your opponent blinks their Eternal Witness, they're going to get it back on their end step. You can instead, it is a face-up exiled card, put it in their graveyard so they don't get it back on their end step. So it works great there as well. Also works great against Suspend. Anything that is put into exile that is going to come back into play at some point, resolve at some point, you can instead use it against your opponent to chuck it into their graveyard. And there are certain decks where you want to be exiling stuff from your graveyard. An Oscar deck, again, I think this is on auto include because you're going to exile an artifact from your graveyard that you're going to make 2 copies of, and maybe you want to do it again, right? So now it's in exile. You can pay 1 mana, put it back in your graveyard so that you can use Oscar's ability again. It's just a fantastic include there. So many different ways to use this card. I love it a lot. It's one of my all-time favorites. But next up today, we got Pulse Mage Advocate, 2 and a white human cleric. And you tap it, return 3 target cards from an opponent's graveyard to their hand. But you can return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And I did not include this card in my AO deck. I probably should have. This is repeatable, recursion, and white. You do not see that very often. And of course, returning 3 cards from an opponent's graveyard to their hand, you use that in a political way, right? It can be a downside if all 3 people at the table are after you. You can just pick lands, ramp, mana rocks, stuff in their graveyard that isn't really going to help them that much. I mean, they're still getting card advantage and value, but it's not really a big deal. More so though, Also, you can use it in a political way where you can play politics, pick the opponent that's not doing so well, pick the opponent that you want to make allies with. So the downside here, of course, can also be an upside, and repeatable recursion, man, that can be really, really good. Next up, we got Pure and Simple, another split card that I've talked about, I think 2 others now on this series, and most of them are really, really good and can be played. Obviously, you have to be in a 3-color deck here because the one half is Gruul, the other half is Selesnya. That does limit where it can go, but I think this can go in any deck that can fit it color-wise. So the Pure side, 1, a red and a green, sorcery, destroy target multicolored permanent. I mean, geez, I wonder if you're ever going to be able to use that in a commander game, right? Like 99% of people's commanders are multicolored permanents. So at the very least, you'll be able to destroy someone's commander with this. And then the simple side is 1 green and a white, sorcery, destroy all auras and equipment. That's also very usable. That can be fantastic against a Voltron strategy. I mean, there are a lot of strategies that are using auras and or equipments other than Voltron strategies, right? It's not just good against that. It's really good against that, but it's also good against other stuff as well. And of course, because it's a split card, you have the option. You can do either or. I think this is a great card in a commander game, and you're never going to have a situation where it's not going to be usable. Coming in at number 4 is Quicksilver Fountain, 3 mana artifact. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player puts a flood counter on target non-island land they control of their choice. That land is an island for as long as it has a flood counter on it. And then at the beginning of each end step, if all lands on the battlefield are islands, remove all flood counters from them. So I've mentioned this card again a couple of times on my channel. I mentioned it recently in a Maluko the Clouded Mirror deck tech because you can pick up your lands, right? What Quicksilver Fountain kind of sort of does, it's sort of a blue blood moon in a way, actually turns those lands into islands so they cease being whatever they were before. And in that Moloku deck, or any deck where you can pick up lands, you're going to put the counter on your land, and then you can pick that land up and then replay it. So now it doesn't have a counter on it. So at the beginning of your end step, it's going to make sure that that doesn't trigger and remove the flood counters, right? That's a way to ensure that those flood counters never get removed. And all of your opponent's lands are eventually going to become islands, right? It's really going to hose them and make it harder for them. The more colors someone's playing, the more difficult this becomes. If your opponent's playing a mono blue deck, it's not going to really hurt them at all, right? And that's where I think this card is particularly good in a mono blue deck. I think any mono blue deck, you could chuck this card in there and it's just going to give you some nice advantage. Particularly good if you have island walk creatures. You know, there are commanders that have island walk as well. I just think it's a great card, particularly for hosing people that are playing lots of colors. But even if someone's just playing a Gruul deck, they're not going to want a bunch of islands. That's really going to slow them down quite a bit. Coming in at number 5, Quicksilver Elemental, 3 blue, Elemental, 3/4. Pay a blue mana. Quicksilver Elemental gains all activated abilities of target creature until end of turn. And you may spend blue mana as though it were mana of any color to pay the activation costs for Quicksilver Elemental's abilities. Just a very unique card. You know, it's sort of like a Necrotic Ooze in a way, where Necrotic Ooze has abilities of cards in graveyards. Quicksilver Elemental can do this, but with creatures on the battlefield, obviously. Just a really neat creature, just a very unique ability. It just sits on the battlefield. Your opponent has whatever activated ability on their creature. You just pay 1 blue mana to copy it. Maybe they have an Arcanus. You can copy that and tap to draw 3 cards. I guess that's sort of the dream scenario, but there's always lots of creatures in a game with lots of other activated abilities on it. And then of course there's a combo potential, right? This card can combo with a lot of other cards if you want to include that in your deck. But even if you just throw this in your deck just because it's a fun, interesting card, I think you can find a lot of ways to use it in a commander game. Coming in at number 6 is Quiet Disrepair. 1 and a green, enchantment aura. Enchant artifact or enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, choose 1, destroy enchanted permanent, or you gain 2 life. This is just such a funny, unique, interesting card. Of course, it's from Future Sight because Future Sight is just filled with interesting cards like that. So you got to read this over a couple times to be like, hey, what's going on here? Huh? Obviously, the versatility of this card is why I like it, okay? So what you can do with this card is you can put it on an opponent's artifact or enchantment if you want to destroy it, okay? Now, green already has a lot of ways for 2 mana or less to destroy artifacts and enchantments. And you don't have to wait until your upkeep, right? You're going to play this on an opponent's artifact or enchantment, and then on your upkeep, you can choose to destroy enchanted permanent. You can also choose not to, right? You can just do this at the beginning of your upkeep. You get to pick whichever one you want. So you can play politics this way, where you put this on your opponent's smothering tithe or Ristic Study or something, and then you're like, okay, well, I'm going to destroy it on my upkeep unless, maybe you can hold them hostage. It's kind of funny that way. Also, though, you can just gain life with this if you want to. That's why I like it. If you're in one of those green life gain decks, and there's a lot of those floating around now, I would prefer this over other options because that life gain could be really, really important to you, right? You just skip the destroy enchanted permanent thing entirely. You put this on a soul ring, right? It's just a mana rock of yours, and it just sits there gaining you 2 life every turn because you want those life gain triggers. So in a green life gain deck, I would definitely find a way to shoehorn this in there because I can use either option if I want to. Coming in at number 7, and I'm going to have a patron who's kind of mad at me for mentioning this one. Quirion Druid, 2 and a green elf druid, 1/2. Pay 1 green mana and tap. Target land becomes a 2/2 green creature that's still a land. I know that doesn't seem like much, but the reason why this card is kind of unique is because that effect lasts permanently. And my patron's going to be a little mad at me because this card's actually not very expensive. And if I mention it, prices might go up. It's sort of an unintended consequence of making these videos is some of these hidden gems that aren't very expensive because people don't know about it. All of a sudden the prices will go up, maybe because of me. I don't know. But this card is pretty unique in that you're just paying 1 green mana to turn that land permanently into a creature. Typically, those kind of effects are only until end of turn. So this card actually is fairly unique in what it's doing. And of course, also works on your opponent, right? This is target land becomes a 2/2 green creature. So you can, say someone's about to cast a board wipe, you can turn your opponent's Cabal Coffers into a 2/2 creature that will then die to the board wipe, right? Because you can obviously do this at instant speed as well. So actually really interesting card. Coming in at number 8 is Rage Forger, 2 and a red elemental shaman, 2/2. When Rage Forger enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each other shaman creature you control. So this card is very interesting because it is a shaman tribal card, and you don't see that much, but it doesn't have to be played in a shaman tribal deck, right? Because the second ability, whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it attacks, you may have that creature deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. That ability fits in any +1/+1 counter theme. You don't need any shamans at all. You can just put this in any red deck that is a +1/+1 counter theme. Works particularly good in a Grumgully deck because Grumgully is a shaman, so Grumgully's gonna get that counter, but Grumgully's also, of course, putting counters on all of your creatures. So now whenever those creatures attack, they're gonna be dealing damage to a player or planeswalker. And of course, we just had that modified theme come out recently in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and this is gonna fit great with that. So if you're doing any modified theme in red, there's a lot of those cards that came out that want counters on them. This can fit in that strategy as well. Coming in at number 9 this week is Raiders Spoils, 3 and a black enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+0. That's not bad. That works in just about any deck. But also, whenever a warrior you control deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 1 life. If you do, draw a card. Okay, so now we're in warrior tribal. So obviously this card is going to work great in a warrior tribal deck, but also I think it just works great if your commander is a warrior and you want to be getting in for damage. There are 28 legendary creatures, right? Commanders that are black in the format. And you look at ones like maybe Grevin, Predator Captain, right? There's a black warrior that you probably are going to be getting in for damage with a lot. Why not get a card draw off of it, right? Dakon Blackblade is another one that typically gets played as a Voltron commander. It's a warrior. Why not get a card draw when you connect? Kresh the Bloodbraided is another one that you're probably going to be attacking with lots. And of course, Zurgo Helm Smasher. That is a warrior and it's black. It's going to get the +1/+0 too. That's not nothing, but then also when you get in for damage, it's going to draw you a card. So I think this card could probably go in a lot more decks. Obviously the warrior tribal decks, but even I'm just getting in for damage with my commander, getting that extra card draw every time can be advantageous. And coming in at number 10 this week is Rally the Horde. Very unique, interesting card, and I absolutely love the art. The art's fantastic on this card. I think that's maybe Godo on the art. Could be, possibly. Looks like him. So 5 and a red sorcery. Exile the top card of your library. Exile the top card of your library. exile the top card of your library. So again, I'm reading the errata text. I know the actual card says remove the top 3 cards of your library from the game, but of course it has been errataed, right? I'm reading the actual errata text, and they separated the 3 exile cards from the top of your library. And I'm guessing the reason is because there can be no shenanigans, right? If you just remove 3 cards from the top of your library, sometimes it can be tricky to know which is the last one you exiled. So I'm pretty sure they separated the 3 because the last one you exile, it's really important to know what that card is. If that last card exiled isn't a land card, repeat this process. Create a 1/1 red warrior creature token for each non-land card exiled this way. So if you want to be exiling the top card of your library, like an Alalia deck, there are decks out there that want to be exiling stuff. So that could be good. It is a bit of a gamble. Like a lot of these red cards, there's a gamble here. I think your chances are pretty good that the last card exiled isn't going to be a land. You probably could stack your deck here a little bit at the very least. So if you repeat the process, you're going to exile 3 more cards. So now you've already gotten 3 warriors. And then again, if the last card is a land, you're probably going to get a couple more. I suppose if the middle cards are also lands, you don't get warriors as well. So it can be a little tricky here. But the interesting thing about this card is you repeat this process forever. If you keep exiling cards that aren't lands as the last card, you will keep going and going and going. You could actually exile your entire library here. I think the chances of that happening are incredibly unlikely. But that's sort of what makes this card fun though, right? I wouldn't take this card very seriously. You could, I suppose, play it in a warrior tribal deck possibly. Again, maybe in that Grumgully deck where they're all going to enter with an additional +1/+1 counter on them. That could be good as well. But for me, this is more of a fun card. Like, let's see what happens. A lot of people like those cards. A lot of people like the cards where they don't know what's going to happen, right? I see people chaos warp their own stuff in a commander game just to see like, hey, let's see what I can get off the top. This is a card where you could end up getting, I mean, I guess you could get 0, right? If you reveal 3 lands from the top of your library right off the bat, you will get nothing off of this. So you could whiff. I think the chances of that are extraordinarily unlikely. You also could get 30 warrior tokens off of this, right? So is it worth it? It's one of those gamble cards, right? Everyone loves gamble. This is a card that could be extraordinarily good for you, also could be bad. A lot of people like taking their chances on cards like that. So there it is if you want to give it a try. But that is it for today. That is 10 more cards you should be putting in your commander decks. And if you are thinking of purchasing any of these cards, I have a TCG Player link. Please give it a click. It helps support the channel. But that is it for today. And thanks for tuning in.